In the last lecture, we started implementing the functionality of protecting our routes from unauthorized users. So in the last lecture, we created this protect function, and this protect function will be responsible for checking if the user is authorized or not. If the user is authorized, then only he can access the protected routes. But if the user is not authorized, that means if he is not logged in that case, this function will throw an error which will be handled by the global error handling middleware. So in the last lecture, we first checked whether the JSON web token, whether it exists in the request or not. We are going to send this JSON web token with the request header. So we are checking if in the request header, we have any header called authorization, and if this authorization header is set with some value. If the authorization header is not there, in that case, this test token will be undefined. In that case, we are throwing a new custom error and we are calling the global error handling middleware. But if the authorization header exists, in that case, this test token will be assigned with that authorization header. And as we learned, the authorization header starts with a bearer. Okay, so from that authorization header, we are separating this bearer and we are only reading the JWT and we are assigning it back to this token. And after that, after checking if the token exists or not, we are also validating that token which we are receiving with the request. For that, we are using this verify function of JSON Web Token package. Now, once we have checked if the token exists and validated the token, now we are going to check if the user still exists in the database. Because it is possible that once the user logged in and tried to access a protected route, in the meantime, the user is deleted for some reason. Maybe the admin deleted the user from the backend. So in that case, the token will still exist, but the user itself is no longer existing. And in that case, we don't want the protected route to be accessed. Okay, so we are going to check whether the user who is trying to access the protected route, whether he exists in the database or not. And doing that is very simple. On the user model, we are going to use find by ID method. So we are going to find a user by its ID. Now from where we are going to get the ID of the user? Well, here if you see, we have the decoded token. So basically using this verify function, we are decoding the token. And in that decoded token, we will have the ID of the user. Let me actually show you that. So let me again go ahead and let me log this decoded token. And let me comment this line for now. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to Postman and let's make a request here. So again, this JWT has expired. So this line of code, this verify function, it has returned that error and that has been handled by the global error handling middleware. So what we need to do is we need to log in again. So let's go to this tab and here let's log this user again. So let's click on this send button. So basically we are making a post request to this URL in order to log in this user using his email ID and password. And we should get a new JSON web token in the response. So the user is now logged in and this JSON web token, it will be valid till 10 million milliseconds, just like how we have specified it. So let me go ahead and let me use this JSON web token in order to access the route. Okay, so now if I make a request, now we are getting all the movies in the response. And if I go back, here you can see this decoded token has been logged. We have this decoded token. In this decoded token, we have the ID of the user. Then we also have the timestamp at which this JSON web token was issued. And we also have the expiration time for that JSON web token. So these are the timestamps, basically the date and time in milliseconds. So from this decoded token, we are going to read the user ID, basically this ID. So let me uncomment this line and let's pass that user ID. For that, we can say decoded token dot ID. Okay, and this function, it is going to run asynchronously. So let's use this await keyword and it is going to return us that user with this ID. So if the user exists with this ID in the database, that user will be returned. Let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable and let's call it user. But if the user does not exist in the database, in that case, it will return undefined and that will be assigned to this user. So now all we have to do is we have to check if this user exists or not. So we know that if the user does not exist, in that case, this user will be undefined. On that, we can use this not operator. That means if the user does not exist, we are going to return an error from here. So for that, let me create a variable. I'll simply call it error. And here, I'm going to create a new instance of our custom error class. Let's say the error message here is the user with given token does not exist. And the error code will be 401. That means unauthorized. And finally, from here, let's call the global error handling middleware. And for that, to this next function, we can pass this error object. So it will call the global error handling middleware. In this case, it will skip all other middlewares and it will call the global error handling middleware. So in this way, we are checking if the user exists in the database or not. So let's test out this scenario. Let's save the changes. Let's go to Postman. And what I will do is I'll first create a new user. So for that, I'm going to use this endpoint, this sign up endpoint. I'll call this user as test. Then I'll say the email address is test@gmail.com. And let's keep the password as test1234. Let's create this user. So the user has been created. Now we are going to use this JSON web token to log in the user, right? So we have learned that once the user will be created, he will be automatically logged in and he will be logged in using this JSON web token. So now, since we have created this test user just now, this test user is now already logged into the application using this JSON web token. So I can use this JSON web token in order to access the protected routes. So I'll simply copy it from here. And what I will also do is, before using this JSON web token, I will go to Compass. Let me refresh the collection here. And let me go ahead and let me delete this user. Okay, so the user is deleted, but the JSON web token still exists for that user. So if I go back to Postman, and now if I try to access this route, this movies API using that JSON web token, let me go and let me specify that JSON web token. So basically, currently the test user is logged in and we are using his JSON web token to access the protected route. That means we can say that the test user is trying to access a protected route, but this test user does not exist in the database because just now we have deleted him, right? So let's see what happens if we try to access this route. You see, we are getting this error message. The user with the given token does not exist. So this implementation is also working as expected. And here, let's modify this message. All right. Finally, one more thing which we need to check is if the user has changed the password after the token was issued. So it is possible that the user has changed his password after the token was issued to him. In that case also, the user should not have permission to access the protected routes and he should first re-log in with the new password to proceed. And to implement this functionality, again, we are going to create an instance method which will be available on all the user documents, that is on all the instances of user model. So let me open the users route here. And just like we created this compare password in DB, which is an instance method here, in the same way, we are going to create another instance method. So for that, we need to create it on the user schema. On that, we need to call methods, and then we can specify the method name. So here I will call this method name as password changed, or I will simply call it as is password changed. Okay, now how are we going to calculate whether the password has changed or not? So for that, what we will do is when someone will call this function, there he need to specify the timestamp when the JSON web token was issued. Okay, so we know that when a user is logged in, a JSON web token will be issued for that user. So we need to pass the timestamp when that JSON web token has been issued for that user. So let's specify a parameter here and let's call it JWT timestamp. Okay, and now what we are also going to do is for this user schema, we are going to create one more property. So we have this confirm password. After that, let's specify one more property. and let's call it password changed at. And in this password changed at field, we are going to store the date and time when the password was changed. And we are going to compare the timestamp of this password changed at with the timestamp when the JWT was issued. Now, this password changed at field, it will be available on the user document only if this field has some value. That means if the user has changed his password. If the user has not changed his password, in that case, this password changed at field, it will be undefined. So in that case, it will not be available on the user document, right? So before proceeding further, first we need to check whether this password changed at field is available on that document or not. So here, let's write an if statement, and there we want to check if this, which will point to the current document, in that document, if we have the password changed at field. Okay, if this password changed at field is present on that document, in that case only we want to proceed. Otherwise, we will return false from here. That means the password has not changed. So keep in mind, if we return true from this function, that means the password has changed. Otherwise, if we return false from here, that means the password has not changed. So for now, what we will do is we'll simply log this password changed at and this JWT timestamp. Okay, and this should be this. So I'm doing this just to show you how these two values looks like and what we need to do in order to compare them. Now, in order to run this function, we need to call this function. So let me go ahead and let me copy this function name, this method name. Let's go back to our auth controller and let's call it here. So here, this user, it is an instance of the user model, because if you remember, to this user variable, a user document will be assigned, right? And since this method here, it is an instance method, we can call this method on that user instance. So here we can say user dot, and the name of the function is password changed. Now here again, we need to pass the value for the JWT timestamp. That means the timestamp at which this JSON Web Token was issued. Now how are we going to get that? Well, if you see here, when we are logging the decoded token, in there we also have this IAT, which stands for issued at. So at this timestamp, the JSON Web Token was issued, and at this timestamp, that JSON Web Token will expire. So we can pass this timestamp to this JWT timestamp parameter. For that, here we can say decoded token dot IAT, which stands for issued at. So that is the property name IAT. Okay, with this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to Postman and let's make a request. And of course, the user with that given token does not exist. So let's go ahead and let's log in another user. So john@gmail.com, and with the password is test1234. Let's log in this user, or maybe we can use this token itself because it would not have been expired yet. So I'll copy it and I will use that token here. And now let's make the request. Okay, so now you can see all the movies we are getting in the response. If we go back to Visual Studio, here we have an error, cannot read property of null, is password changed. That's because this document, when we used this JSON Web Token, that means this user has been logged. The user with this email ID, john@gmail.com. And if I go to Compass, there for that user, we don't have any password changed at field, right? So again, we need to create a new user in order to test this functionality. So let me go ahead and let me sign up a new user. Again, I will call it test because we have already deleted that test user from the database. And there, let me also go ahead and let me set the password changed at field. And let's put some date here. So today's date is 13th May 2023. So I'll put a future date here, maybe 2023 May 14th. Okay, let's create this request. So the user has been created, and for that, the password change date is saved. This simply means that the user changed his password on this date. And this JSON web token that has been generated on today's date, right? Today is 13th May 2023. And we have said that the password was changed on 14th May 2023. So here the password has changed after the user has logged in, right? So in this case, the user should not be allowed to access the routes, the protected routes, because after the JSON web token has been issued, the user has changed his password. So in this case, the user should not have access to the protected routes. But currently we have not implemented that functionality yet. Currently we are simply logging the value of password changed at and the JSON web token timestamp, right? So let me go ahead and let me copy this JSON web token. Let's go to this get API where we are getting all the movies in the response, and there in the header, in the authorization header, let me use this JSON web token for the test user which we have just created. And let's use this JSON web token in order to access this route. So if I make a get request here, we are getting all the movies now in the response. And if I go back to Visual Studio, again we have that error. Let me go to user model and let me check what we have named this function. So it is password changed only. Oh, all right. So inside this function, we want to use this keyword, right? So first of all, this function should not be an arrow function. It should be created using this function keyword. And this should also be an async function. Okay, let's remove this arrow from here. Let's again save the changes. Let's go back to Postman. Let me make a request again. Let's go back to Visual Studio. And now you will notice that now this password changed at is logged here. So you can see it is a date time value, and this JWT timestamp that is also logged here, and that is basically a timestamp. Now, in order to compare this date time value to this timestamp, either we can convert this timestamp to a date time value, or we can convert this date time value to a timestamp and then compare these two values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert this password changed at, which is a date time value, to a timestamp. So here what we'll do is we will create a new variable. I will call it password changed timestamp. Okay, now in order to convert this date and time to a timestamp on this date and time, we can call a function called get time. Okay, so this function, it will convert this date and time into a timestamp. And here let's go ahead and let's log that timestamp. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to Postman again and let me make a request. Let's go back to Visual Studio. And now you will notice that the timestamps have been logged. So this time here, it has been converted to timestamp, and that has been logged here. Now the problem here is this timestamp here, it is in seconds, but this timestamp here, it is in milliseconds. So we also want to convert this timestamp into seconds instead of milliseconds. So for that, all we have to do is we have to divide this timestamp, which is in milliseconds, by 1000. And let's also pass that value to integer. And for that, we can use pass int function. Okay. Now let's save the changes. Let's go ahead and let's make a request again. And if I go back to Visual Studio, now both of them are in seconds. So now we can compare them. And here we also need to specify the base. So in this case, it is going to be base 10. All right. So now this password change timestamp and this JWT timestamp, they are in the same format, that is in form of timestamp, and they also have the same unit, that is in seconds. So now we will compare these two values, and if the comparison return false, that means the password is not changed after a new token was issued. Otherwise, if that comparison returns true, in that case the password has changed after the token was issued. In simple terms, if the JWT timestamp, if it is less than password change timestamp, that means the password was changed after the JWT was issued. So in that case, we want to return true. Otherwise, if the password change timestamp, if it is less than the JWT timestamp, that means if it has been changed before the timestamp was issued, in that case we want to return false, because that means in that case the password has not been changed after the JWT is issued. For example, here this JWT timestamp is this timestamp, right? So let me copy it from here. Let me give a comment here. So this is the JWT timestamp. If it is less than the password change timestamp, that means this timestamp, that means the password was changed after the JWT is issued, right? JWT was issued at this timestamp, and after that, since this timestamp is greater than this timestamp, that means the password was changed after the JWT was issued. So in that case, we are going to return true. Otherwise, we will return false. So this function here is password changed. It is going to return a Boolean value. So let's go to this authcontroller.js and let's wrap this expression within an if condition. So here let's see if the user password has changed after the JSON Web Token has been issued for that user, we want to return and call the next function. And to this next function, we are going to pass our custom error. So for that, let's first go ahead and let's first create our custom error. I'll simply call it as error. And in order to create a new instance of the custom error class, we need to use new keyword and then the name of the class, which is custom error. Here, let's specify the error message. And here, let's say the password has been changed recently. Please log in again. Okay. And then the error code will be 401, which stands for unauthorized. And let's pass this error message to the next function. Otherwise, if this statement returns true, that means if the password has not been changed after the JSON Web Token has been issued, then we want to call the next middleware in the stack. So if the execution control has made it till this point, that means till this point, if no error has occurred and everything was okay, then only we will allow the users to access the protected route which he has requested for. Now, one more thing which we can do here is we can attach the user object to the request here. So we can say request dot user. Basically, we are creating a new property on this request object called user, and to that we can assign this user object. Okay, for now it does not make any sense, but in the future this might be useful. So now let's go ahead and let's test this one more time. So let's save the changes, and if you remember, when we created this test user, he will be automatically logged into the application, and this JSON Web Token has been created for that test user. And for this test user, we have also set the password changed at to future date. That means tomorrow's date. But this JSON Web Token has been issued today. Okay, so here in this case, the timestamp for this JSON Web Token will be less than the timestamp for this password changed at. And in this case, this condition here, it will return true. So in that case, we should get this error message in the response. So let me go back and let me make a request again. And you see, we are getting that error message here. The password has been changed recently. Please log in again. So this logic here, it is also working as expected. Now, if the password is not changed after a new token is issued, in that case, in the response, we should get all the movies. So let's try that also. For that, let's go back to Compass. And here we have set the password changed at date to 14th of May. So let me go ahead and let me change it back to maybe 12th of May. That means yesterday's date. So now the password changed at date is before the date when the token was issued. So let me go ahead and let me update this. Basically, the token was issued on 13th of May and the password was last changed on 12th of May. So this date is before the date when the token was issued. So in this case, we should get all the movies in the response. It should not give us this error message. Okay, so let's make a request again. And for some reason, we are still receiving this error message. The password has been changed recently. Let's see why is that. Let's go to VS Code. So we are calling this is password changed and it should return false if the password change date is before the token was issued. So in this case, this password change date, it will be smaller than this JWT timestamp. So in this case, it should return false. But for some reason, it is returning true. And this if statement is getting executed. Okay, all right. So if you notice, this function here, it is an async function and it will return a promise. So here we need to wait for that promise to get resolved. Okay. Here what I will do is I will create a variable. I will call it maybe is changed or is password changed. And to that, I will assign this expression. And here inside this if statement, let's use this variable. Okay, let's save the changes again. Let's go back to Postman. And now again, let's make a request. And now we should get all the movies in the response. So that is also working as expected. All right, so in this lecture and in the last lecture, we implemented this protect functionality, which will protect the routes from unauthorized users. And in order to protect the routes from unauthorized access, all we have to do is we have to call this function before calling the route handler middleware function, like we are doing here for this get all movies API. So if we want to protect this get movie route handler also, that means if you don't want to allow unauthorized users to get the details of a movie, then they also we can use this function. We can call this middleware before the actual route handler function. Okay, with this, let's save the changes. And now this get movie route should also be protected now. All right, so this is all from this lecture. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.